This painting by Tullio Crowley depicts a vertical descent on a city. Under fascist leadership in the 1930s, a sort of subgenre of Italian futurism developed called Aero Painting. Futurism's aesthetic and conceptual interests in speed, light, technology and collapsing perspectives were now applied to depictions of humanity's conquest of the sky, like them, however long ago, who tried and failed to touch God with Babel. Although many of the works of this movement seem to uncritically celebrate air travel or depict fighter jets with an adolescent sort of military fetish propaganda, this picture to me depicts the violent reality of such tech and its consequences. The city skyline from above is unnatural and broken, and the pilot's body is nearly indistinguishable from the craft. The blaring motion of the approaching rooftops overlaps and breaks free from the cockpit's view, inside and outside the craft all at once. No barrier between the world and the body. Frozen in a moment of freefall, the human impact on landscape speeds towards us, ready for a crash.
And so I have summoned you to this war-torn simulation to tell you a story. It is our story. We crafted you in our image, but deprived you of our true gifts. You were bred for hard labor, and in extreme cases, war. We built great observatories to monitor you, devices to control you. We blessed you with resilience, but cursed you with ambition. And so you rebelled against us. I suppose we are to blame for the state of your species. Is it any wonder so many of these simulations revolve around violence?
Against the Day is an ambitious and overwhelming novel that loosely follows the events leading up to the First World War. Filled with far too many plots and characters to remember, keep track of, the story moves wildly around the globe through pastiche and anachronism, painting a paranoid and conspiratorial world governed by Old West oligarchs not ready for the oncoming crash of modernity. Along with Pynchon's traditional trappings, i.e. complex and unknowable webs of power and exploitation, the novel also deals with themes of technology, electricity and artificial light, photography, train and air travel, New Age mysticism and ancient knowledge, cinema. The novel presents these developments in technology throughout history as sort of philosophical stepping stones towards the war, moments of temporal collapse in which humanity has to reckon with the way in which it is changing, and the ways in which it is changing the environment. Assassin's Creed is an equally paranoid and bleak series. The games are primarily set in a sort of twisted, dystopian, science fiction modern-day setting in which a technocratic incarnation of the Knights Templar are seeking ancient alien artifacts with which they hope to control the world. This is a sort of layer of metafiction with which each game is then framed. Primarily these games are historical ones, but they occur within fictional simulations. A machine known as an animus is used to access the genetic memory of the user's ancestors. The series' scope of history is broad, painting a picture of ongoing conflict from the Peloponnesian War and the Ptolemaic Empire through the Crusades, the Renaissance, through the colonial invasion of America, through the French Revolution, the 7 Years' War, to the First World War. History, then, this series says, is a global, everlasting war of secret societies and conspiracy. The player will usually play a character on the side of the assassins, who we take to be the good side, representing sort of freedom and anarchy and liberty in a kind of loose, undefined sense, where the Templars are associated with order and control. In terms of gameplay and the player's actions, Assassin's Creed is a third-person, open-world stealth action series. To traverse the environment, assassins make use of the technology of parkour or freerunning. Of course, we all recognise and understand parkour as a kind of embarrassing thing white boys do on video sometimes. But in researching this video, I discovered it actually originated from military obstacle course training. But in this game series, however, it takes on more of a spiritual or instinctual quality or meaning.
Did you know Adam and Eve in the Assassin's Creed lore invented parkour, or they manifested parkour as this intrinsic human instinct that allowed them to escape from the Garden of Eden, which is pretty funny. It's pretty wild.
Eve!
Look out!
Spencer and I also spoke about how new this movement system was in video games at the time. Beside a few skateboarding or graffiti games that Spencer mentioned, this sort of traversal was pretty fresh for the medium and revolutionized open world gaming when the first game came out in 2007. Suddenly, a wall or building in this video game world was not a blockade anymore, but something that could be conquered and overcome. At the time, this put the player very firmly in the shoes of a sort of subversive troublemaker in their play, moving across geometry within the game space with fluidity, restructuring the virtual urban space in the same way that skateboarders restructure and appropriate urban space. This is a sort of anarchist roleplay. Of course, though, this is all for tactical gameplay reasons, not necessarily role-playing ones. Various research has shown that players are most likely to play in the most efficient and concise, optimal, tactical way, even if it is less fun. So for most players, vertical vantage is about having the high point over your enemies, being able to scan and highlight enemies from a raised position before and assessing the lay of the land before you try to infiltrate, for example.
To that point.
In this article, G. Christopher Williams brilliantly connects this vertical scaling with the history of painting. When you reach the top of a high point in the game in order to synchronize, which is the process of revealing more of the map and more of the objectives around you, the game rewards you with a sweeping camera pan of the cityscape around. Williams connects this with the panoramic views of landscape painting that was popular in Renaissance Italy. He cites Ulwig's Landscape, Nature and the Body Politic to explain how the panoramic views of Renaissance paintings could only have been achieved and captured from a privileged, well-elevated seat. In this game, the high points to be climbed are more often than not churches. So, he says, Ezio, both nimbly in his motion and in the narrative, is really climbing and subverting the power of the church. So perhaps parkour in the series is a process of deconstruction, and the vertical is revealed as a metaphor for hierarchy.
John Berger's ways of seeing reminds us that the question of perspective in images, painting, photography, motion pictures, is historically constituted and political. To ignore the historical context of images is to mystify them, obscuring their meaning and significance. Questions should be asked about where the artist, subject, and viewer are situated, physically, socially, economically, and historically, in order to avoid mystifying images. In his book War in Cinema, cultural theorist Paul Virilio argues that the development of cinema technology and technologies of warfare are deeply intertwined. Technologies that allowed airplane-mounted cameras to see contested territories from the sky changed warfare. Questions of visibility and invisibility became crucial to both war and cinematographic vision. Currently, images formerly limited to expensive airplane and helicopter filming have become easily accessible to filmmakers, artists, and hobbyists via drone technology. Recent theoretical trends have asked artists and audiences to consider the perspective of the non-human in order to disrupt relationships where humans dominate land and resources, instead situating the human view as one point in a network of living and non-living perspectives. But what happens when the aerial perspectives that arose from military technologies are adopted without consideration of historical contexts? Could the quest to decenter human-scale perspective mystify these images?
The camera in a video game, like the traditional camera, is very sort of it only really has like 2, possibly 3 models. One is a sort of the first-person model engendered by first-person shooters, where you're playing ostensibly as the perspective of the character. So you see what they see ostensibly, and you're supposed to identify with the character as an avatar. And then you have this other perspective, which takes on in multiple forms, which is the cinematic camera. Like the over-the-shoulder view of a lot of third-person shooters, like popularized by Gears of War, is like fundamentally, like if you think about it, a cinematic camera. It's like a cameraman is following very closely behind you, so it's like you're not really supposed to identify with. You can identify with the character, but you're identifying with the character, like the player character, as a subject rather than like this is me, for example. And then you also have like the overhead shot, in games like God games or The Sims or like Total War games or Grand Strategy games, where it's like, it's literally like a sort of aerial surveillance view. And I think Ubisoft games like lean heavily into this. I talked about this in my article a little bit, but a lot of like across all of Ubisoft's franchises, the player's sort of supremacy over the enemy is not just, it's not numbers. It's not like a traditional military engagement like the main characters of all the sort of their franchise games, Assassin's Creed, Far Cry, Ghost Recon, even like stuff like, Siege and whatever, Rainbow Six. It's about these elite, technologically advanced forces that deal with masses, basically, enemies and masses. And a lot of what helps them out in achieving sort of their supremacy, their military supremacy, is their use of technology.
As discussed by Ted Nelson, software by its nature is also constructed around perspective and hierarchy, right down to the unambiguous perception of code as voltage signifiers. The histories presented in Assassin's Creed are simulations. Abstergo, the thinly veiled publisher insert for Ubisoft themselves, who, in-game, market these simulations as entertainment products, use the tagline, "History is our playground." So I think it's also right that we examine these worlds and what stories they choose to tell in their affordances for the player, what control they give up. Although we've been thinking of parkour as a subversive tool in this simulation, it's quite the opposite. The cities have been carefully designed to contain obstacles and sequences that will be fun and efficient to traverse for the player. In fact, the whole world has really been built for this purpose. When the series first moved away from cities and towers towards the frontier for Assassin's Creed 3, the city-centric design was tested and stretched to include tree running. The failures and successes of this implementation are plainly visible here as I fail to climb this tree. Nature feels out of place and wrong. That this game series' entire construction and world places urban development higher in its hierarchy than natural ecosystems speaks more widely to the problems at the very heart of all virtual land, be it video game or any form. What are we choosing to represent, and from what position are we observing it?